Part 1, Question 1, Article 10, whether in Holy Scripture a word may have several senses. In other words, can a given passage in Scripture have multiple meanings? This is a tough question. It's a question of the truth versus a truth. It is not, however, a negation of truth. It's not assumed that just because a word can have multiple meanings, that therefore there can never be any truth. It's just a question of, are multiple correct interpretations possible? And the authority cited is St. Gregory the Great. Quote, when Scripture describes a fact, it reveals a mystery, which means facts and mysteries can coexist side by side without conflict. By mystery, we don't just mean an unknown fact like who is going to win the ball game, or what card is the magician holding, or who is the secret murderer that will be revealed in the last chapter. No, mysteries go deeper. An example is the mystery of the suffering of the innocent, or the mystery of the Trinity, things that we can explore, we can ponder fruitfully, but we can't ever get to the bottom of it and express it as a mathematical equation, because not everything can be expressed that way. This is possibly a problem, though, if we claim that theology is a true science. Wouldn't multiple meanings to a single passage lead to confusion? And the Bible, as we've said before, must be clear. And if we allow for multiple meanings, then this would lead to multiple different systems of interpretation. For example, I might say that a passage means A, B, and C. St. Augustine would claim it means D, E, F, and G. Could both systems be right? How then would we choose if there are almost infinite number of systems that we could possibly choose? And what about Isaiah 59:1? God's arm is not short. Should we interpret that literally? What would that mean? I answer that the author of Holy Writ is God, in whose power it is to signify his meaning not by words only, as man also can do, but also by things themselves. In other words, we write, human beings write with words. God writes with history also, really all of creation, with everything. God writes with all of creation. And Thomas continues by making a distinction between the literal sense of a word and the spiritual sense. But he notes that the spiritual sense is based on the literal and presupposes it. It doesn't contradict, it's not opposed to the literal sense. And there's a further distinction. The spiritual sense can be broken down to the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. Anagogical means upwards. The words of Scripture have a literal meaning. They also tell us about Jesus. That's the allegorical sense. They tell us how to act. That's the moral sense. They tell us how to get to heaven. That's the anagogical sense. And this is all described in the Catechism, paragraph 115, from paragraph 116. Quote, the literal sense is the meaning conveyed by the words of Scripture and discovered by exegesis following the rules of sound interpretation. All other senses of sacred doctrine are based on the literal. That's a quote in the Catechism from Thomas. So in other words, doctrinal clarity is not sacrificed. Quote, nothing necessary to faith is contained under the spiritual sense, which is not elsewhere put forward by the Scripture in the literal sense. Yes, multiple systems of interpretation are possible, even profitable, all based off of the literal sense, the literal meaning, all recognizing that truth cannot contradict truth. And speaking of God's arm, the literal sense is not that God has such a member, a physical arm like that, but only what is signified by that member, namely operative power. In other words, the literal sense does not mean wooden literal sense. When the author of sacred scripture mentions an arm, the author could be referring to the power of what an arm does, mainly doing things. In these first 10 articles, this first question, Thomas has defined and defended his project of exploring revelation using reason. He has given himself latitude and also limits.